Think about a family where the dad once tried to get a job and accidentally caused a citywide catastrophe, where the mom is holding everyone together through sheer terrifying competence. Where the oldest kid is a blue cat who doesn't always have a face, the middle child is a goldfish walking on two legs, and the youngest is a baby pink rabbit who is genuinely the smartest person in the room at all times. And they all live in a town called Elmore, which is in California, which is apparently fine and normal. That's the Amazing World of Gumball. And if you've seen it, you already know it's something special. If you haven't, first of all, where have you been? And second, don't worry, I'll explain everything as we go. This video is for both groups, so here's what we're doing tonight. We're going through every significant relationship in this show. Friendships, family bonds, romances, rivalries, all of it. And we're ranking them from the most toxic down to the most genuinely wholesome thing this cartoon ever gave us. Which is saying something, because Gumball absolutely did not shy away from showing what love actually looks like when it's complicated. Or when it's kind of terrible. Or when it's so sweet, it makes you feel something you weren't prepared to feel at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. I want to be upfront that this isn't going to be some clean, clinical list where I just say, number 1, toxic, because X and move on. That's not how this show worked. And it's not how this video is going to work either. These relationships have layers. Some of the ones that start toxic get better. Some of the ones that seem fine have a darkness underneath if you look closely. And the truly wholesome ones, they're wholesome in a way that's earned, which is the only kind that actually means anything. Alright, let's start at the bottom. The toxic end. The ones that, if a friend described this dynamic to you over coffee, you'd set your mug down very slowly and say, I think you need to talk to someone. We're beginning with Rob and Gumball. And I need to give you a little context here, because Rob is one of those characters whose entire arc is pretty much the show's secret emotional spine, if you're paying attention. Rob starts as a background character, literally. He's just a kid who exists in the background of Elmore Junior High. And in a show where literally everyone is a distinctive cartoon creature of some kind, being a generic background character is its own category of existence. He's a kid with a mismatched eye, one blue and one normal looking. And for a long time, he's just there, in the crowd, unnamed. Then something happens that changes everything. Gumball and Darwin accidentally get trapped in the void. This metaphysical garbage dump that the universe uses to dispose of things that don't make sense or that were mistakes. And when they escape, they leave Rob behind. They don't mean to, but they do. And Rob gets left in there for what feels like an eternity of dimensional nothingness. And when he finally gets out, he's changed. He's been fractured and rebuilt by the void. And he's got a VHS remote control he can use to mess with reality. And he has decided that Gumball Watterson is his nemesis. Now here's where it gets interesting. Rob chose Gumball as his nemesis, not because Gumball is particularly evil or did anything malicious. Gumball literally just forgot about him. That's the wound. Not violence, not cruelty, just being forgotten. Being so thoroughly overlooked that when Rob needed someone to remember he existed, no one did. And Gumball's response to Rob declaring himself Gumball's nemesis is, and this is so perfectly Gumball, he's kind of flattered, and then he's annoyed. And then at various points, he's genuinely trying to connect with Rob in this weird bumbling way that somehow makes everything worse. There's an episode where Gumball is so desperate to have a cool nemesis relationship that he keeps trying to do villain and hero banter with Rob, and Rob is just exhausted by it. Because Rob doesn't actually want a nemesis relationship in the fun comic book sense. He wants acknowledgement. He wants someone to look at him and see him. The dynamic is toxic in a really specific way. It's not abusive in the traditional sense. Rob isn't hitting anyone. Gumball isn't being cruel. But the power imbalance is significant. Gumball, for most of their relationship, has the luxury of treating this whole thing as a fun adventure. A game. Something exciting. And Rob is operating from a place of genuine pain. He was unmade and remade by a cosmic force of erasure. And the person most responsible for that is out here having a good time, while Rob is trying to reassemble his identity. There's an episode called The Nemesis, where this dynamic gets really explicit. Rob has put together this elaborate plan to get revenge, and Gumball's response is basically to try to help Rob be a better villain, because Gumball's ego is so wrapped up in the idea of having a worthy nemesis that he would rather coach his enemy than take the threat seriously. And somehow, that's simultaneously endearing and kind of awful, because it means Gumball is still, even in trying to engage, centering himself. By the end of the series, something shifts between them. There are moments, particularly in the Inquisition and in the final arc, where Rob and Gumball move towards something that isn't exactly friendship, but isn't pure antagonism either. Rob, who has been spending so much energy on being Gumball's nemesis, ends up in situations where he's sort of reluctantly cooperating with the Wattersons. And you can see, if you're watching carefully, that what Rob actually wanted all along wasn't to destroy Gumball. He wanted to matter to him. He wanted to be seen. That's a deeply human thing, wrapped in cartoon logic, executed with a level of emotional clarity that most adult dramas don't bother with. And it makes the Rob Gumball dynamic the kind of toxic that breaks your heart a little, because the toxicity is born entirely from loneliness. Okay, shifting now. Miss Simeon and her students. Or more specifically, Miss Simeon's relationship with the concept of her students' well-being, which she appears to regard as a mild inconvenience at best. Miss Simeon is an ancient mandrill. And I do mean ancient. The show canonically establishes that she's been around for millions of years, who has been teaching at Elmore Junior High for what appears to be a geological age. She's been teaching so long that she taught Principal Brown, which is already a disturbing piece of information. She's bitter. She's resentful. She has a desperate need for approval that she channels into either trying to get awards or trying to make her students' lives miserable in ways she can technically justify. Her relationship with Gumball, in particular, is a masterclass in what institutional authority looks like when it's been soured by decades of disappointment. Miss Simeon doesn't just dislike Gumball. She has a personal grudge that she nurses with genuine devotion. She's tried to get him expelled. She's manipulated situations to humiliate him. In the grades, she essentially changes reality itself to make his life worse, which, in a show where that kind of thing is technically possible, is an escalation even by Elmore standards. And yet, and this is the thing that makes Miss Simeon more interesting than a simple cartoon villain, there are moments where you see the person she might have been. There's a whole episode dedicated to her relationship with Principal Brown, and you realize that underneath all the bitterness is someone who has been teaching for so long that she's forgotten what it was for. She wanted, at some point, to matter to her students. She wanted to shape minds. And somewhere along the way, maybe after the 10,000th student who didn't care, maybe after one too many years of watching kids she'd taught grow up and forget her name, she curdled. The dynamic with her students is toxic in the institutional sense. She has power over them. She uses it for personal grievance. And she does it with enough plausible deniability that she rarely faces real consequences. Sound familiar? Yeah. The show is doing something intentional there. Miss Simeon is a critique of a certain kind of teacher, or authority figure generally, who confuses control with care and has been in their position long enough to lose the distinction. What's interesting is that the students, particularly Gumball, never really give up on the idea that Miss Simeon could be different. Gumball has helped her. He's defended her. He's gone to genuinely uncomfortable lengths to make her life better, and she's repaid that kindness by trying to get him expelled within the same episode. It's exhausting, and it's also, quietly, one of the most realistic dynamics in the show, because that's what it's like when you keep extending good faith to someone who keeps exploiting it. Now, I want to talk about something a little more specific: the jealousy episodes. Because jealousy is its own relationship dynamic in Gumball, and the show treats it with a specificity that I find kind of impressive. The most significant jealousy arc involves Gumball's relationship with himself, which sounds very abstract, but bear with me. Gumball is, at his core, deeply insecure. He wants to be special. He wants to be the main character, and the show plays with this explicitly at multiple points, with Gumball occasionally becoming aware that he's in a cartoon and reacting with a mixture of existential dread and self-importance. His jealousy isn't usually of strangers. It's jealousy of the people closest to him, which makes it much more uncomfortable. There's his jealousy of Darwin, which surfaces in The Sidekick and a few other episodes. Darwin is technically Gumball's pet goldfish, who grew legs and joined the family, and Gumball has very complicated feelings about his best friend and brother being better at things than him. When Darwin starts to flourish, when he gets attention or success or recognition, Gumball's response is not always graceful. Sometimes it's outright mean, and the show doesn't let him off the hook for it. Gumball's jealousy of Darwin is portrayed as small, as petty, as something he should be ashamed of, and usually he is, eventually. There's also his jealousy around Penny, which we'll get to in much more detail later, but which often manifests as possessiveness rather than jealousy in the traditional sense. When Penny gets attention from other boys, or when she's succeeding at things without him, Gumball can get controlling in a way that the show explicitly frames as not good. He has to learn, repeatedly, that loving someone doesn't mean owning their attention. And then there's the jealousy between Richard and his mother, Granny Jojo, which deserves its own section because it is genuinely one of the most uncomfortable dynamics in the show. Granny Jojo and Richard. Oh boy. Okay, so Granny Jojo is Richard's mother. She's a pink rabbit like Richard, and she appears in a handful of episodes. And every single time she shows up, the energy in the Watterson house gets significantly worse. Not because she's a cartoon villain in the mustache twirling sense. She's much more unsettling than that, because her dysfunction is the recognizable kind. Granny Jojo has never fully let Richard grow up. The evidence for this is everywhere. Richard, as an adult character, is, and I say this with fondness, a disaster. He's sweet and loving and almost completely incompetent at the practical demands of adult life. He doesn't work. He can't cook without causing structural damage to the kitchen. He's been shown to be afraid of things that are genuinely not scary. And there is a direct line between who Richard is as an adult and how Granny Jojo raised him. She's protective in the way that becomes smothering. She's loving in the way that becomes controlling. She treats Richard not as an adult with his own family and his own life, but as her child, always, in a way that actively undermines his ability to function. And when Nicole, Richard's wife, a woman who is keeping this entire family alive through sheer force of will, asserts herself or pushes back on Granny Jojo's intrusions, Granny Jojo responds with wounded victimhood. She positions Nicole as the obstacle, rather than looking at herself. The episode The Mothers deals with this most directly, and it's squirmy to watch in the best way. It's the kind of uncomfortable that comes from recognition. If you've ever watched a family navigate a difficult mother-in-law or father-in-law situation, you know exactly what this episode is doing. What makes it toxic, rather than just complicated, is the zero-sum quality of it. Granny Jojo's love for Richard seems to require that no one else's love for him take precedence. She can't be happy for him without also being threatened by the happiness. And Richard, who is not exactly equipped with the emotional vocabulary to handle this, tends to ping-pong between the two women in his life in a way that satisfies no one, including himself. It's not the darkest dynamic in the show, but it's one of the most recognizably human ones. And recognizable dysfunction hits different than cartoon villainy. Let me take a small detour here, because I've been fairly serious for a while, and I think we need a moment. There's a relationship in this show that doesn't fit neatly into toxic or wholesome, and that's Tobias and basically everyone. Tobias Wilson is the kid at school who is very confident, very self-assured, and almost completely wrong about everything, including how charming he is. His relationship with Gumball is antagonistic in a low-key way that's less about real conflict and more about two people who just fundamentally don't get each other. Tobias thinks he's cool. Gumball finds him insufferable. And somehow, they keep ending up in situations together. It's the kind of relationship where no one is really the villain. No one is really the hero. And the main dynamic is that everyone involved finds the whole thing slightly annoying. I don't know why I find this so relatable, but I absolutely do. Okay, back to the rankings. We're moving out of the purely toxic zone now and into what I'd call the complex zone. These are the relationships that have real problems and real beauty in them. Sometimes in the same episode, sometimes in the same scene. They're not toxic, and they're not simple. And they're probably the most interesting category in this whole video. First up, Gumball and Penny, and specifically, the arc that culminates in the shell. If you've seen the shell, you know. If you haven't, I'm going to try to describe what happens in that episode in a way that does it justice. And I want to warn you right now that I'm probably going to fall short, because the shell is one of those episodes that works because of everything that came before it. Penny Fitzgerald has been a recurring character since the first season. She's a peanut. Literally a peanut, with antlers, and she's in a shell for most of the early series. This is played as just a visual design choice for a while. One of many absurdist details in a show where every character is a different kind of creature. But as the show develops, the shell becomes something more intentional. Penny is hiding. She's hiding because showing who she really is feels dangerous, because the people around her, including Gumball, have a version of her in their heads that she's terrified to contradict. The shell episode happens when Penny's shell breaks during a school play, and what's inside isn't a peanut girl. What's inside is a shape-shifting creature that's different in every moment. Sometimes humanoid, sometimes a horse, or a dragon, or a flock of birds. Because Penny can be anything, and she never knew whether people would love her if they saw all of it. The emotional center of this episode is Gumball's response. And here's where the show does something I wasn't expecting when I first watched it. Gumball, who has had feelings for Penny for 2 seasons, doesn't flinch. He doesn't panic. He looks at this person who is terrified that her transformation means she'll lose him. And he says something that is so simple and so exactly right that I actually had to sit with it for a minute. He tells her that he loves her, not in spite of what she is, but because of it. All of it. Now, I want to be clear. Gumball is not perfect. He's been awkward about his feelings for Penny for years. He's said the wrong thing. He's embarrassed her. He's made her feelings about him when they should have been about her. But in this moment, in the moment that matters most, he gets it exactly right. And that's the thing about complex relationships. They don't have to be perfect all the time to have moments of genuine grace. The shell sets up the rest of Penny's arc, where she walks through the world as her transformed self and has to figure out who she is when she's not hiding. And Gumball, to his significant credit, is mostly there for that, rather than making it about himself. Mostly. He has his moments. The Romantic is the episode where Gumball tries to make a grand gesture for Penny, and everything goes wrong in ways that are both hilarious and a little bit instructive. I want to spend some time here because this episode is a really good illustration of one of Gumball's core relationship flaws. He has this tendency, and I recognize this tendency because I think a lot of us have it, to confuse the performance of love with love itself. He wants the big moment. He wants the dramatic gesture. He puts so much effort into creating an experience for Penny that will prove he loves her, that he doesn't actually listen to what she wants. The grand romantic plan becomes about Gumball's idea of romance, rather than about Penny. This isn't a malicious thing. It's not manipulation. It's just, he's 12. And he's seen enough movies and TV shows to have absorbed the idea that love looks like a grand gesture. And he hasn't yet figured out that what most people actually want is someone who pays attention to them, who sees them, who doesn't make their love into a performance. The episode is funny because everything goes spectacularly wrong, but it also has this thread of truth running through it about the difference between loving someone for who they are versus loving the idea of them. Gumball loves Penny. That's real. But sometimes he loves the story he's telling about their relationship more than he loves the actual person in front of him. And that's something he has to keep learning to correct. What saves their relationship, and I think this is genuinely interesting, is that Penny sees it. She knows Gumball well enough to understand the gap between his intentions and his execution. She doesn't excuse it, but she has patience for it, because she also knows that the love underneath the clumsiness is real. And she's not exactly perfect either. She's been playing her own version of a role for years, hiding in her shell, presenting a version of herself she thought people could accept. They're both learning to be real with each other. That's complex. That's the work of a relationship. And the show portrays it with a specificity that feels earned. Darwin and Carrie. This one snuck up on me, honestly. And I think it sneaks up on a lot of viewers because Darwin's romantic feelings for Carrie are introduced through The Matchmaker, which is an episode that's primarily about something else, and then quietly reveals itself to be about Darwin being in love. Carrie is a ghost. She floats. She has no physical body in the traditional sense, which creates obvious complications for a relationship with Darwin, who is a goldfish who does have a physical body, and who is, it must be said, quite earnest about everything he does. Darwin is not the kind of person who does things halfway. When he's your friend with his whole heart. So when he has feelings for someone, those feelings are similarly whole. The problem in The Matchmaker is that Darwin doesn't have the confidence to tell Carrie how he feels. So he tries to engineer a situation where they'll end up together through a series of increasingly elaborate schemes. This goes, as you might expect, extremely poorly, because schemes always go poorly in Gumball, and also because the premise of the scheme, getting Carrie and another boy together so that Darwin can, what exactly? Move on? is one of those plans that doesn't bear too much scrutiny. What's interesting about Darwin and Carrie is that their dynamic is actually quite sweet when you strip away the complications. Darwin's feelings for Carrie are pure in a way that Gumball's feelings for Penny sometimes aren't. He's not performing. He's not trying to be someone he isn't. He just genuinely thinks she's wonderful and doesn't know how to say it. And Carrie, who is by her nature somewhat removed from the ordinary world, floating through walls, unable to touch things, existing in a slightly different register than everyone else, seems both touched by and uncertain about being the object of that kind of warmth. There's a tenderness in what they have that the show doesn't exploit for cheap drama as much as it could. The complications are there, but the show treats both of them with enough respect that the complications feel like real obstacles rather than manufactured conflict. By the later seasons, their relationship develops in ways that involve Carrie being able to inhabit physical space through various plot mechanisms. She possesses Gumball at one point, which is its own thing, and the arc of it is toward greater closeness, toward figuring out how connection works between two people who exist differently. That's not a bad thing to think about when you're drifting off to sleep. Let me talk about something I find genuinely fascinating about the show's approach to relationships before we get to the big ones. Gumball, the show, as a whole, has a really interesting relationship with the idea of forgiveness. Most kids' shows treat forgiveness as a reset button. Character does something bad. Character apologizes. Everything is fine. Lesson learned. Credits. Gumball doesn't fully do that. The apologies happen, but the history remains. Gumball's history of making things about himself is something Penny references. Richard's history of incompetence is something Nicole carries. Darwin's loyalty is occasionally something Gumball has taken for granted and had to reckon with. The relationships in this show have weight because the past has weight. Things don't just disappear because someone said sorry. This is going to be relevant when we get to Nicole and Richard, which is probably the most emotionally complex relationship in the entire show. Nicole and Richard. Nicole Watterson and Richard Watterson. The parents at the center of this whole thing. I want to start by saying that Nicole Watterson is one of the most interesting portrayals of a mother in animated television, and I include shows made specifically to be taken seriously when I say that. She's not a joke. She's not a punchline. She's not just the competent one who rolls her eyes at her bumbling husband, even though she is technically the competent one, and she does technically roll her eyes at Richard quite a bit. She's a person, a complicated person, with a history and desires and frustrations, and an amount of barely suppressed intensity that is, frankly, kind of scary. The Choices is the episode that recontextualizes everything about Nicole and Richard's relationship. It does this through a sliding doors style sequence where we see alternate versions of Nicole's life. What might have happened if she'd made different choices? What might have happened if she'd pursued her own career more aggressively? Or if she hadn't stayed with Richard? Or if she'd built the life that looked successful on paper rather than the one she actually has? And here's where the show does something unexpected and kinda brave. The alternate lives that look more successful on paper, more career achievement, more recognition, more of the things society tells you should add up to a fulfilling life. Those lives are emptier. Not in a saccharine family is all that matters way, but in a specific, characterized way that acknowledges what Nicole gave up, while also showing that what she has is real and full and worth it. Nicole chose Richard, and the show doesn't pretend that was an easy choice, or that Richard deserves it in some obvious way. Richard is, genuinely, a lot. He's a lot of work. He's loving and warm and completely unable to handle the basic logistics of adult existence. Nicole essentially runs the family single-handedly, while also working a full-time job. And there are moments in the show where the weight of that is visible on her face. She's tired. She didn't sign up to be the only adult in a house full of people who need her, including her husband. But Richard loves her, fully, simply, in the way that some people love who are lucky enough to have never learned to hold back. He's not sophisticated about it. He doesn't have grand romantic gestures. What he has is a steadiness of feeling that doesn't waver. He's never once shown to doubt his love for Nicole or his commitment to their family, even in his worst, most incompetent moments. And Nicole, who is surrounded by things that need to be managed and controlled and handled, has chosen a person who is, in his chaos, completely real. He can't be managed. He can only be loved. The job is the other episode I want to spend time on. In this episode, Richard gets a job as a pizza delivery man, and reality begins to unravel. The logic of the show is that Richard Watterson having a job is so fundamentally contrary to the nature of the universe that causality itself starts to break down, which is a comedic device, but also sort of says something about how much the universe has organized itself around Richard being exactly who he is. What makes The Job a relationship episode is the Nicole throughline. While reality is literally falling apart around everyone, Nicole has to decide how she actually feels about Richard potentially becoming capable. And the episode is honest about the ambivalence there. On one hand, of course she'd love more help, more stability, a partner who can contribute in practical ways. On the other hand, Richard becoming competent in Etienne means Richard changing, and she loves the person he is. The ending preserves the status quo, but the episode has done the work of showing that the status quo is a choice Nicole makes, repeatedly, with eyes open. The Nicole-Richard dynamic is complex rather than toxic, because underneath all the difficulty, the love is genuine, and the choice is mutual. Nicole isn't trapped. She's made a decision about what kind of life she wants, and she keeps making it. And Richard, for all his bumbling, is completely devoted to her in a way that is, when you actually look at it, quite beautiful. Okay, I need to take another little tangent, because we've been going for a while, and I want to check in on how you're doing. If you're still awake and reading along, hi, hello, welcome, sorry the show is so interesting, that's kind of the problem. If you're already drifting, perfect, keep going, let the words become shapes. We're about halfway through our rankings, and we're heading toward the good stuff, the really wholesome end, which is where things get warm enough that I think even the most alert brain starts to soften a little. I want to mention something before we get there, though. One of the things that makes Gumball worth spending this much time on, at this hour, in this format, is that it takes the people who got left behind seriously. Rob, who we talked about at the very beginning. The background characters of Elmore, who occasionally get moments in the spotlight that reveal they're as complicated and sad and hopeful as anyone. There's an episode about a newspaper delivery man. There's an episode about a hot dog vendor. There's an episode about the universe having a plan for Gumball that turns out to just be a very old computer program running on a simulation. Every time the show threatens to let its world become a backdrop, it turns and looks directly at something that was hiding in plain sight. I think that's why the relationships in this show feel real. Because the show insists that everyone has a story. Even the characters who are there to be obstacles. Even the characters who are cruel. Even the characters who are, by any reasonable metric, kind of terrible. We're moving into the genuinely wholesome territory now, and I want to start with Penny's transformation arc. Not just the episode, but the whole ongoing story of who Penny becomes after the shell. After Penny's shell breaks and she reveals her true nature, the show commits to something that animated shows don't always commit to: consequences. Penny's life is actually different now. She can't go back to being the peanut girl in the shell. She's out, and the world has to deal with that. And so does she. What follows is a character arc about self-acceptance that is, for its target audience, genuinely instructive in a way that doesn't feel preachy. Penny is uncertain. She doesn't know what she looks like, because she changes. She doesn't know how to carry herself in the world as her real self, when her real self is so dramatically different from what people expected. She worries, quietly, because Penny is good at carrying things quietly, that the people who loved the version of her that was in the shell won't love this version. The show answers that worry pretty definitively. Her family, her friends, and especially Gumball, love her with the same steadiness they had before. And slowly, Penny starts to love herself in the same way. What I find particularly moving about this arc is what it does with Penny's parents. Her father, Patrick, spends some time being resistant. He's protective in a way that curdles into control, worried about what the world will do to his daughter now that she's so visibly different. And Penny has to push back on that. She has to make the argument to her own father that she gets to be who she is, and that his fear for her isn't permission to put her back in a box. The resolution of that father-daughter dynamic is earned in a way that a lot of these arcs aren't. Patrick doesn't just suddenly understand and change. He struggles. He gets it wrong a few more times. And then, gradually, he comes around. Not because he stopped being afraid, but because he loves his daughter more than he loves his fear. That's a story about identity, and about the people who love us having to learn to love the whole person, not just the version they're comfortable with. And it's told in a Cartoon Network show aimed at kids. It never stops being impressive. Nicole's fierce love. I want to come back to Nicole, but from a different angle now. We talked about the complexity of her marriage, the weight she carries, the choices she's made. Now I want to talk about her as a mother, because Nicole Watterson's relationship with her children is one of the most purely intense things in the show. Nicole is terrifying. Not in a bad way, in the way that a force of nature is terrifying, in the way that something completely committed to a purpose is terrifying. When one of her children is threatened, Nicole becomes something beyond a cartoon cat. She becomes a category of danger that other characters in the show have learned to treat with the appropriate level of fear. There are multiple moments across the series where Nicole's response to someone messing with her family is so disproportionately effective that it becomes a running gag. Except it's a gag with teeth, because you always believe that she's capable of exactly what the gag implies. She's beaten up people who threatened her kids. She's outcompeted everyone in her path when her children's well-being was at stake. She has made entire city blocks rethink their life choices. But here's what makes this interesting, rather than just funny. The show also shows Nicole's love as something that can be too much. There are episodes where Nicole's protectiveness tips over into smothering, where her need to fix things for her children prevents them from learning to fix things for themselves, where her own unprocessed stuff, her own difficult childhood, her own complicated feelings about being enough, gets expressed through over-involvement in her kids' lives. The episode The Parent deals most directly with this, and it's interesting because it puts Nicole in a position where she has to watch her children handle something without her intervention, and it physically pains her. Not because she doesn't trust them. She does. She actually does. But because she has spent so long being the person who makes things okay, that not doing that feels like failing. What the show eventually gets to, through Gumball and Darwin and Anais each having to assert their own capability and agency at various points, is Nicole learning that loving fiercely doesn't always mean acting. Sometimes the most ferocious thing you can do for someone you love is hold yourself back and let them be enough on their own. That's a lesson Nicole has to learn over and over, because it doesn't come naturally to her. And the repetition of the lesson feels true. We don't just learn things once. We have to keep learning them. Now, Anais. I want to talk about Anais Watterson, because in a show full of characters who are compelling and distinctive, Anais is maybe the most underrated. Anais is the youngest Watterson. She's 4 years old, and she is, without question, the most intellectually capable person in the family. She's strategic. She's analytical. She sees through most of the nonsense her brothers get into immediately and from a distance. And she's 4. There's a joke in this that the show plays consistently, that the family's most effective member is a toddler in a bow. But underneath the joke is something kind of sweet. Anais loves her family. She loves them even though they drive her crazy. She loves them even though Gumball and Darwin regularly involve her in schemes that any reasonable 4-year-old would decline. She loves them even though she is obviously too smart for most of what goes on in the Watterson house. Her relationship with Gumball specifically is one of the best sibling relationships in animated television. They bicker constantly. Gumball is perpetually surprised by how capable Anais is, despite the fact that she has demonstrated this capability approximately 10,000 times. Anais is perpetually exasperated by Gumball's inability to think more than 30 seconds ahead, and yet, when something actually matters, they're there for each other. The sibling dynamic is textured in a way that feels like siblings who actually grew up together, not siblings who were written to deliver exposition to each other. Anais's relationship with her parents is similarly specific. With Nicole, there's a mutual recognition. 2 people in a house full of chaos who have both, in different ways, decided to be the competent ones. With Richard, there's a tenderness that's different from how she interacts with anyone else. Richard is not intimidated by Anais the way some people are. He doesn't feel threatened by her intelligence. He just loves her, plainly and completely. And Anais, who is surrounded by people who respond to her intelligence with either awe or wariness, finds that uncomplicated love genuinely restful. There's an episode where Anais runs for class president or something similar, and the whole thing spirals into the kind of chaos that Gumball episodes tend to spiral into. And Richard's response to everything is this cheerful, devoted belief that Anais is going to be fine. Not naive belief. He's not missing what's happening. He just believes in her. That's a different thing. Before we get to the biggest one, Gumball and Darwin, I want to talk about a few more relationships that deserve their spot in the wholesome category, because there's a richness to the supporting world of Elmore that I don't want to skip over. Banana Joe and his parents. This seems like an odd choice, but stay with me. Banana Joe is kind of a background character who shows up in class scenes and occasionally gets a spotlight episode. His parents are, you guessed it, larger bananas, and the family dynamic is played mostly for comedy. But there's something sweet in how unreservedly they love their son, even when he's being ridiculous, which he often is. Banana Joe is frequently ridiculous, and his parents just keep loving him, unreservedly. The unconditional quality of it is played as a joke, but it's also just kind of wholesome. Susie and her parents. Susie is the character whose face is literally a live-action human child's face on a cartoon body, which is one of the show's most effective pieces of surreal horror if you think about it too long. So don't think about it too long. Her family dynamic, in the brief moments we see it, mirrors her own energy. Strange, slightly unsettling, but genuinely affectionate. There's a homeostasis to them. They've found their level. Penny and her family, beyond what I mentioned earlier about Patrick, have this warmth that exists even through the complications. Her sister and her mother are genuinely supportive in ways that matter. The Fitzgerald household is not perfect, but it's loving in a way that you can feel, and that love is part of what gave Penny the resilience to eventually step out of her shell at all. And now, Gumball and Darwin, the one that ties everything together. I've been building to this because I think it deserves the space, and also because I think this is the relationship in the show that most people feel the most about, whether they've articulated it or not. Gumball and Darwin are brothers. They're best friends. They are, in many episodes, essentially one creature expressed as two bodies, finishing each other's thoughts and making the same questionable decisions in stereo. But the relationship isn't simple. They fight. They have fundamentally different personalities. Darwin is empathetic, warm, prone to feeling things deeply in a way that he doesn't always know how to process. Gumball is confident, bordering on arrogant, creative in ways that are usually disasters, certain of his own importance in ways that the universe repeatedly fails to confirm. And somehow, through the friction of these two very different people who love each other very completely, they become more themselves, not less. The Origins is the episode that tells the story of how Darwin became part of the family. And I want to be careful here, because The Origins is one of those episodes that hits differently depending on when you watch it. If you watch it as a kid, it's a heartwarming story about a goldfish who found a family. If you watch it as an adult, it's a meditation on what it means to choose someone, to decide that a person is yours and act accordingly. The setup is that young Gumball had multiple pet fish before Darwin, and they all, one by one, for various fish-related reasons, died or left. And Gumball, who is at this point a very small child, is genuinely devastated by each loss. The episode runs through these losses with a lightness that the show does well. They're funny, they're brief, they're depicted with the particular cruelty of childhood loss that doesn't last, but feels enormous when you're in it. And then Darwin comes. And Darwin is different from the start. More present, more responsive, more aware. And Gumball, who has been burned by the impermanence of pet ownership in increasingly ridiculous ways, is initially guarded. But Darwin is so insistently himself, so clearly a specific being with a specific personality and a specific claim on Gumball's attention, that Gumball can't help it. He falls in love. Not romantically, obviously, platonically, completely, in the way that children love people who become their whole world. And then Darwin grows legs and walks out of his fishbowl and joins the family. And the episode, in a moment that works almost entirely because of what it doesn't say, because of the simple visual of Darwin stepping into the world and Gumball being there, captures something about friendship that most shows spend 3 seasons getting to. The choice to be together. Not circumstance, not convenience, but actual active choosing. Darwin doesn't have to stay with the Wattersons. He's become capable of independence. He can go. The episode makes that clear. And he chooses to stay. He chooses Gumball. He chooses this family. He chooses to be Darwin Watterson rather than whatever he would have been otherwise. That's not a small thing. The Gumball-Darwin dynamic across the rest of the series builds on this foundation in ways that are both funny and quietly profound. They fight about dumb things. Who gets to control the remote? Whose idea for an adventure was worse? Whether Gumball's latest scheme is a good idea, it's never a good idea. Darwin is always right about this. Gumball never learns. They have misunderstandings that escalate in the way that misunderstandings between very close people can escalate. Because when someone knows you that well, their misreadings sting more. But they also, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, they also see each other. Really see each other. Darwin sees Gumball's insecurity underneath the confidence. He knows when Gumball is acting out because he's scared, not because he's being malicious. And Gumball sees Darwin's sensitivity as a feature, not a bug, even when he's not always careful enough with it, even when he says the wrong thing. He knows that Darwin feeling things deeply is one of Darwin's best qualities, even if Gumball sometimes wishes Darwin would just let something go. There are episodes where the two of them have to make a sacrifice for each other, and those episodes work because the show has done the work of making us believe in the relationship. When Darwin does something difficult for Gumball, we feel it because we know how much he means it. When Gumball sets aside his ego to be genuinely there for Darwin, we feel it because we know how much it costs him. That's what good storytelling does with relationships. It makes the audience feel the weight, and Gumball, consistently, makes us feel the weight. I want to spend a moment on the Gumball and Darwin dynamic specifically in the context of growing up, because I think this is where the show gets genuinely emotional if you come to it as an adult. Gumball and Darwin are in that phase of childhood where your best friend is your whole world, where the friendship is so total and so consuming that you can't really imagine existence without it. This phase ends. For most people, it ends somewhere in adolescence, when individuation kicks in and you start needing your friends to be people rather than extensions of yourself. The friendship doesn't necessarily go away. Sometimes the best ones survive the transition, but the quality of it changes. The show never quite gets there. Gumball ends before its characters have to make that transition. And I think that's part of what makes the Darwin-Gumball friendship so affecting. We get to see it in its fullest, most total form, before the complications of growing up have touched it. It's preserved, amber, and watching it at whatever age you are now, in this format, you probably feel something about that particular quality of closeness, about being that known by someone, about choosing each other every single day without it being complicated. That's worth sitting with for a second. All right, we're in the home stretch now, and I want to make sure we've covered the depth of what this show actually does with wholesome love before we bring everything to a close. The most wholesome thing Gumball does, as a show, as a piece of storytelling, is insist that love is active, that it's not a state you arrive at and then maintain passively. Every significant relationship in the show requires the people in it to keep choosing it. Nicole chooses Richard every day. Gumball chooses Darwin every episode. Penny chooses to trust Gumball with the real her. Darwin chooses the Wattersons over and over again. This is a kids' show. And it's telling kids, who are still forming their understanding of what love is and what relationships are, that love is a verb, that it's something you do, not just something you have, that the relationships that survive are the ones where both people keep showing up. That's not a small lesson. That's one of the most important lessons anyone can learn. And Gumball delivers it through cartoon chaos, and absurdist humor, and the occasional existential crisis about the nature of the simulation they all live in, which is, honestly, maybe the most effective delivery method. I want to do something a little different for this next section, and go back through some of the moments I consider the most quietly stunning in the show's treatment of relationships. Not the big episodes, not the shell or the origins or the choices, which we've already talked about, but the smaller moments, the in-between ones. There's a moment in a relatively inconsequential episode where Darwin and Gumball are walking home from school, and they're just talking, about nothing in particular. And the shot holds on them walking for longer than it needs to, and they're just together, present, not doing anything important, just existing in each other's company. And it's one of those moments where the show earns everything it's tried to build, because the relationship doesn't need drama to be real. It just needs to exist. There's a moment between Nicole and Gumball. I don't remember exactly which episode, and it might be in the background of something else, where she looks at him with an expression that is entirely separate from the joke happening elsewhere in the scene. Just a look. A mother looking at her son. And it lasts maybe a second before the show moves on. But it's there. And if you catch it, it lands. There's a moment where Richard is trying to help Anais with something he's completely unqualified to help with, and he's getting it very wrong. And instead of correcting him, she just lets him help. Not because the help is useful, but because it means something to him to be needed. And Anais, who is 4 years old and functionally smarter than most adults, understands this and makes the calculation to let him feel useful. That's emotional intelligence in a preschooler. That's a character. These moments don't make it into the episode descriptions. They don't get gifted or made into compilations. Well, maybe some do. They're just there, if you're watching closely. The show trusts you to catch them. Let me bring things back around to where we started, with Rob. Because I said the Rob-Gumball dynamic was toxic, and I stand by that. But I want to add something. Toward the end of the series, there's a moment where Rob and Gumball are on the same side of something, where the problem is bigger than their conflict, and they have to work together. And in that moment, briefly, in the spaces between plot mechanics, you can see what their relationship might have been if things had gone differently. If Rob hadn't been left in the void. If Gumball had been the kind of kid who noticed the quiet background character. If the show had gone longer and given them more time. There's a version of Rob and Gumball that would have been a great friendship. Two weird kids in a weird school who complemented each other in interesting ways. Rob's methodical, strategic thinking paired with Gumball's chaotic creative instincts. They could have been something good. They never quite got there. The show ends before they do. But the shadow of what they could have been is visible in those moments. And it makes the whole arc sadder and sweeter at the same time. Because that's what the toxic stuff in this show is really about. Not evil, not malice, but lost potential. Relationships that could have been something and weren't. Because of timing or circumstance, or one moment of carelessness that had cascading consequences. That's a very human thing to put in a cartoon about a blue cat and his pet goldfish, who is also his brother. Okay, let me do a full rundown of where everything landed, now that we've gone through the nuance. Because I started this video by saying we were ranking from toxic to wholesome, and I want to honor that structure even if the ranking has been complicated by actually talking about what these relationships are. Most toxic. Rob and Gumball's adversarial dynamic, specifically in the early seasons, before any rapprochement. It's toxic because it's born from a wound that was never properly addressed, and because the power imbalance between Gumball's obliviousness and Rob's pain is never quite resolved. Very close second, Miss Simeon and her students. Institutional toxicity is still toxicity, and Miss Simeon's use of her authority to work out her personal grievances on children who have no real recourse is the kind of dynamic that the show is critiquing even while it plays it for comedy. Complicated and uncomfortable. The jealousy patterns in the show, particularly Gumball's jealousy of Darwin and his possessiveness around Penny. These aren't toxicity in the full sense because they're recognized as problems and worked on, but they're patterns that, left unaddressed, would become something worse. Complicated and painful. Granny Jojo and Richard. Love that has calcified into control. Tenderness that has become possessiveness. The version of familial love that keeps someone small because small is easier to hold. Complex and beautiful. Nicole and Richard. Two people who have chosen each other across their differences and their difficulties, who keep making that choice, and whose love, while imperfect and sometimes exhausting, is genuinely real and sustaining. Complex and tender. Darwin and Carrie. Two people figuring out how connection works between beings who experience the world differently. Still figuring it out. Doing it gently. Complex and growing. Gumball and Penny. A relationship that started as a crush and became something more interesting. Two people learning to be real with each other. To love the actual person rather than the version of the person they'd constructed in their heads. Genuinely wholesome. Penny's whole arc, particularly her relationship with herself. what it means to step out of a shell, literal or metaphorical, and trust that the people who love you will love the real version. Deeply wholesome, Nicole's relationship with her children. Fierce and sometimes overwhelming, but entirely motivated by love, and growing, slowly, imperfectly, toward the kind of love that trusts its recipients to be enough on their own. Wholesomely specific, Anais' place in the family. The youngest, the most capable, surrounded by people who love her in different and complementary ways. Most wholesome, Gumball and Darwin. Two beings who chose each other, who keep choosing each other, whose friendship is the beating heart of everything the show does. There's something I want to say before we close about what we've been doing for the last however long this has taken you to get through. We've been talking about a cartoon that aired on Cartoon Network and was made for kids. And I've been treating it with the same seriousness I'd bring to almost anything, because I think it deserves it. Part of what Cartoon does, part of what I love about this format, this whole thing we do here, is take the stories that we absorbed when we were young and look at them again with older eyes, not to debunk them or to find problems with them, but to see what was actually in there, what the people who made these shows were actually saying, sometimes to us and sometimes through us, about what love is and what it costs and what it looks like when it's good and when it isn't. Gumball, watched again as an adult, is saying something clear and consistent about relationships. It's saying that love isn't passive. It's saying that the people who love you best are the ones who see you, not the version of you that's easiest to love, but you, weird and complicated, and sometimes embarrassing, and frequently wrong. It's saying that the toxicity in our lives usually comes from pain, not evil, and that understanding the pain doesn't excuse the toxicity, but does make it something you can work with, rather than something you simply have to endure or run from. It's also saying that sometimes a goldfish grows legs and walks into your life and becomes your whole world, and that's fine. That's actually kind of the best. Okay, I realize I've been building toward a conclusion for a little while now, and then I keep finding more things to say, which is very on brand for me. And also I think is actually the right instinct here, because I don't think we've quite finished yet. There are a few more relationships I want to dig into. Specifically, the ones in the middle of our ranking that I breezed past a little because I was so excited to get to the big ones. Let me go back and fill those in properly, because they deserve it. Alan and Carmen. Now there is a couple. Alan is a balloon. Carmen is a cactus. This is, on its face, the setup to a joke. What's the most obviously catastrophically mismatched pairing in Elmore? A balloon and a cactus. Get it? But the show does something characteristically kind with it. Alan and Carmen work. They're careful with each other. They've figured out how to exist in close proximity without one of them destroying the other, which requires a specific kind of thoughtfulness and a willingness to actually pay attention to your partner's particular fragility. Now, the show does sometimes play the obvious joke. Carmen accidentally popping Alan is a recurring gag, but the relationship itself is portrayed with genuine sweetness. Alan is one of the nicest characters in the show, almost obnoxiously so. He's so relentlessly positive and kind that other characters occasionally find him grating, which is its own kind of statement about how we react to goodness that doesn't have an edge on it. And Carmen is prickly, literally. Again, she's a cactus, in a way that grounds Alan's sweetness. They complement each other. They're also just two kids who have a crush that became something more. And the obstacles they face are practical ones that they navigate through care rather than drama. There's an episode where Alan and Carmen have an argument, a real one, not a misunderstanding that gets cleared up in 2 minutes. And the episode takes the disagreement seriously. It doesn't resolve it cheaply. The characters have to actually work through it, and the resolution involves both of them genuinely adjusting their understanding of each other, not just one person apologizing and everything snapping back to normal. That's relationship craft. That's showing kids what it actually looks like to work through something. Hector and, well, everyone in Elmore. Hector is the giant who lives in the outskirts of town. I think he literally lives in the mountains, or just beyond them, and his size creates a fundamental relationship challenge that the show explores quite thoughtfully. How do you connect with people when your scale is so different that physical proximity is dangerous? Hector's friendships with smaller students at Elmore Junior High require enormous care on his part. He has to constantly calibrate. constantly be aware of the impact of his presence, in ways that smaller people simply don't have to think about. His mother is overprotective in a way that mirrors Nicole's protectiveness, but from a different angle. She's kept Hector isolated for much of his life because the world is genuinely not built for him, and he can genuinely hurt people without meaning to. The isolation is well-intentioned, but damaging. Hector has grown up without the normal social development that comes from navigating relationships. And so when he does try to connect, he doesn't always know how. There are episodes where Hector's attempts to participate in normal school social life go spectacularly wrong, and the show has the grace to not make him the villain of those episodes. He's not malicious. He's just someone who was never taught how to fit into a world that wasn't sized for him, and he's figuring it out in real time. And the figuring it out is messy, and sometimes destructive, and also very human. His relationship with his mother is complex in a way that's worth naming. She loves him so completely, so protectively, that she's undercut his ability to function. This is a recurring theme in the show's parent-child relationships. The love that becomes a cage isn't always the controlling kind of love. Sometimes it's the protective kind. Sometimes it's the kind that wants so desperately to keep someone from being hurt that it prevents them from learning that they can survive being hurt. Principal Brown and Miss Simeon. Oh, this one. Okay, I mentioned earlier that Principal Brown was taught by Miss Simeon, which means he was her student before he was her boss, which is already a lot of information to process about a relationship. But their romantic dynamic, which the show maintains consistently as a background element, is genuinely one of the weirder pairings in a show full of weird pairings. They're together. They're together in a way that neither of them is particularly discreet about, which makes it awkward for everyone at Elmore Junior High, but especially for Gumball, who frequently stumbles into their awkward moments and has to process them in real time. Principal Brown is the most benign adult authority figure in the school. He means well. He just has the spine of a very anxious jellyfish and makes decisions based on what will cause him the least immediate trouble, rather than what's actually right. Miss Simeon is, as we've established, something of a force of nature when it comes to personal grievances. Their dynamic, when you actually look at it, is one where Miss Simeon has significantly more power than Principal Brown. Despite his nominal authority over her as an employee, she gets away with things. He gives her latitude he shouldn't. And you can see, in the way he looks at her in certain episodes, that he's been in love with her for a very long time and hasn't fully figured out that love isn't an excuse for abdication. There's something sad underneath this too. Miss Simeon is not a whole and happy person. She's bitter and resentful and stuck. And Principal Brown has organized his life around accommodating her, which means he's also stuck. Stuck in the orbit of someone who needs him most when she's at her worst, which is pretty much always. He's not a bad person. He's just someone who made a choice about who to love and has been living with the consequences of that choice without ever really examining whether it's good for either of them. The relationship is more toxic than it appears on the surface, I think, because it's a relationship that enables Miss Simeon's worst tendencies rather than challenging them. A partner who loves you enough to tell you when you're wrong, who holds you to a standard, who doesn't just accommodate. That's a relationship that makes you better. A partner who can't say no to you is a partner who, however much they love you, is not giving you what you actually need. I want to circle back to something I mentioned briefly, and I think is worth expanding. The concept of the void, and what it means for the relationships in Elmore. The void is a metaphysical concept in Gumball that gets introduced and then expanded throughout the series. The basic idea is that Elmore exists as a kind of world that runs on internal logic. Things that don't make sense, or that represent mistakes, get pulled into the void, erased, disposed of. It's a dark concept for a cartoon. The implication is that there's an external force, maybe the universe, maybe whoever made the simulation of Elmore, if you follow that reading, that decides what belongs and what doesn't. Rob ends up in the void. That's the event that defines his character arc, as we discussed. But the void's existence casts a shadow over all the other relationships in the show, if you let it. Because every one of these characters exists in a world that has a deletion function. Every relationship they build exists in a world that has erased people before. And yet they build them anyway. The Wattersons don't know about the void, mostly. The students at Elmore Junior High aren't thinking about erasure when they're arguing about whose lunch is whose. The relationships in this show happen in the ordinary way that relationships happen. Imperfectly, hopefully, with more heart than sense most of the time, and the presence of the void doesn't stop them. This is the show's most interesting philosophical move, I think. It builds a world with an inherent fragility. Things can be unmade, people can be forgotten, mistakes can be disposed of, and then shows us characters who love each other anyway. Not because they're ignorant of the risk, not because everything is safe, but because that's what loving does. It doesn't wait for safety. It doesn't wait for guarantees. Gumball chooses Darwin every episode, not because he's certain of anything, but because that's who he is. Nicole chooses Richard every day, knowing exactly what she's choosing and what it costs. Penny steps out of her shell into a world that might not receive her well, because being known is worth the risk of being rejected. The void is a perfect narrative device for this theme, because it literalizes the thing that every love story is actually about: the terrifying possibility that what you love might not last. And the response to that in Gumball is not despair. It's not careful distance. It's the opposite. It's more love, more fully, more consciously. Okay, I want to dig into some more specific episodes now, because we've been doing a lot of big picture analysis, and I think there's value in the granular stuff. The specific moments in specific episodes where the show's emotional intelligence really shows itself. The mothers, which I mentioned earlier, is worth spending more time on. The episode sets up a comparison between Nicole and the mothers of other characters at Elmore Junior High, and it's structured as a kind of competition, which is the show's favorite way to force a real confrontation between characters. The competition reveals things that a normal conversation wouldn't surface, because competition removes the social lubricant of politeness. What gets revealed is that each mother has her own version of love, her own version of what it means to be a good parent, and that these versions are sometimes incompatible with each other, but not wrong. Darwin's mom, who is a different character, it's complicated. This show has a complicated conception of family, has a warmth that is immediate and tactile, in a way that Nicole's love isn't always. Nicole's love is strategic and protecting and fierce in a way that Darwin's mom's isn't always. They're different, and the episode doesn't declare a winner in any meaningful sense. It just shows you different shapes of love and lets you recognize your own. The Nicole thread in this episode is specifically about Nicole learning that her way of loving her children, the fierce, managing, capable way, is not the only valid way, and that recognizing other ways of loving doesn't diminish hers. This is a lesson that, honestly, a lot of adults could stand to learn. The instinct to compare modes of care and declare one superior is pretty universal and pretty consistently unhelpful. The Blame is an episode I find surprisingly sharp for a cartoon. The premise involves the parents of Elmore trying to ban violent video games because they believe the games are causing their children's behavior issues. And Gumball and Darwin, who are genuinely quite poorly behaved at times, have to navigate this and also make the argument that the games aren't the problem. What makes this a relationship episode, unexpectedly, is what it reveals about how the Elmore parents relate to their children's interiority. The parents who are trying to ban the games don't actually know what their kids experience when they play them. They're inferring based on external behavior, without curiosity about internal experience. They're reacting rather than engaging. And the episode, with characteristic subtlety, is saying something about the relationship between parents and children that isn't just parents are wrong and kids are right. It's more nuanced than that. It's about the failure of curiosity, the failure to actually ask. Gumball and Richard, in a small subplot, have to actually talk about what games mean to Gumball, why he likes them, what they give him, what they're for. And Richard, who is not intellectually equipped to follow most of the argument, still manages to come away from it with something. He tries. He asks questions. He doesn't dismiss what Gumball is saying, even when he doesn't fully understand it. And that trying, that genuine attempt at curiosity, even when the understanding doesn't fully land, is what good parenting looks like in this show. Not omniscience, not always getting it right, but trying. Let me talk about Gumball's relationship with himself for a while, because we haven't really done that, and I think it's central to everything else. Gumball Watterson is a character defined by the gap between who he thinks he is and who he actually is. He thinks he's the hero of his own story in a pretty literal way. There's an episode where he becomes aware of the show's narrative structure and tries to position himself as the protagonist with all the benefits that implies. He thinks he's charming when he's frequently awkward. He thinks he's smart when he's frequently just creative in ways that happen to occasionally stumble into smartness. He thinks he's brave when he's often just reckless. But here's the thing. He's not delusional about these qualities in a harmful way. He's aspirational. He wants to be those things. And the wanting is genuine. And sometimes the gap between the wanting and the reality is funny. And sometimes it's painful. And sometimes, when he actually comes through, it's genuinely moving. His relationship with himself is complicated by the fact that he has a family that loves him comprehensively. Nicole loves him ferociously. Richard adores him. Darwin believes in him completely. Anais knows him better than he knows himself. Having people who love you that much, that consistently, shapes how you see yourself. Gumball can be confident in ways that might otherwise seem unjustified because he comes from a place of being deeply, consistently loved. The confidence is, in part, structural. He knows he is loved, which gives him a ground to stand on, even when he's wrong about almost everything else. What's interesting is watching what happens when that confidence falters. When Gumball doubts himself, really doubts himself, not just the situational embarrassment of a scheme going wrong, the show gets very quiet. There's a quality to Gumball's self-doubt that is different from his normal chaos. It's stiller, and in those quiet moments, the people around him show up in specific ways. Darwin talks to him. Nicole holds him. Even Richard, in his way, finds the right thing. The love he comes from becomes something he gets to fall back into when he needs it. That's the gift that a functional family gives a kid. Not that they never doubt, not that everything is always okay, but that there's something to fall back into. I want to spend some time on the show's treatment of grief, because it comes up in ways that are easy to miss, but important. Darwin was a goldfish. The fish before him all died. This is established in the origins, with a lightness that is characteristic of the show. The deaths are depicted briefly, with a kind of absurdist humor that keeps them from being traumatic, but the emotional weight is still there. Gumball experienced loss before Darwin, multiple times, and each loss was real, even if it was played as comedy. And then Darwin came and didn't die, grew legs, stayed. And part of the reason the Gumball-Darwin relationship is so weighted, I think, is that Gumball has already learned that the things he loves can go away. Darwin's permanence in his life is not taken for granted. It's not that Gumball consciously thinks about this. He's 12 and not prone to that kind of reflection. But it's there, in the substrate, in why he holds on to Darwin so fiercely. Why losing Darwin, even temporarily, in various episodes, hits him so hard. Grief is also present in Rob's arc. What Rob is grieving, in the most fundamental sense, is the life he would have had. The Elmore Junior High experience that he missed because he was in the void. The friendships that formed while he was gone. The ordinary adolescence that should have been his and wasn't. Rob's villainy is grief wearing a disguise. It's the rage that comes from loss that was never acknowledged, never processed, never had a witness. There's an episode, I believe it's The Disaster, and its sequel, The Rerun, where Rob actually has the power to rewind and redo events. And what he uses that power for is, in part, to try to fix his own story, to make things come out differently for himself. And when that doesn't work, when even with that much power, the fundamental wound of being forgotten can't be undone, the devastation on his face is very real. The show has the courage to sit with that, to show a character in the grip of grief that has no clean resolution, and to not supply a clean resolution. Rob's story doesn't end with everything fixed. It ends with a kind of accommodation, a life that has meaning in spite of the loss, not because the loss was undone. That's a very mature thing to put in a cartoon. Okay, random tangent that I've been meaning to include and keep forgetting. The Wattersons' house. Their house is alive. Partially. It has eyes and occasional agency and has been shown to have something like feelings. And I bring this up because the house is, in a weird way, a character in the family's relationship dynamics. It's witnessed everything. All the fights and the reconciliations and the disasters and the evenings that were just normal and fine. The house has absorbed the Wattersons completely, and there's something quietly beautiful about that. The idea that the space you live in together becomes part of the relationship, takes on the character of the people in it. I don't know why I find this so touching. Maybe it's late. Maybe everything is touching at a certain hour of the night. But the idea that a family can love a place into something alive, that your shared life together becomes part of the physical space you share. That's a nice idea. You can carry it to sleep with you. Let me come back to Miss Simeon one more time, because I want to say something more careful about her than I did at the beginning. Miss Simeon has been teaching for a very long time. The show canonically states she's been a teacher since before modern history. Roughly, she's been depicted in historical scenes going back to ancient times, and each time she's teaching. Generation after generation after generation of students. And somewhere in there, she started to hate it. Or not hate it exactly, but became unable to access whatever it was she once loved about it. This is a tragedy in slow motion. The teacher who cared enough to keep teaching for millennia, but lost the thread of why. And the toxicity of her relationship with her students, with Gumball specifically, is the toxicity of someone who has been failed by the profession she chose, by the students who didn't care, by the system that kept her teaching long past the point where teaching was sustainable for her, by time itself, which kept sending new 12-year-olds through her door when she'd already had everything she had to give worn down to nothing. None of this is an excuse for how she treats Gumball. Being damaged doesn't give you the right to damage others, especially when you have institutional authority over them. But it does mean that when I call the Miss Simeon student dynamic toxic, I want to be precise about what kind of toxic it is. It's not the toxicity of cruelty for its own sake. It's the toxicity of exhaustion, of someone who ran out of resources long ago and has been running on resentment ever since. If you've ever had a teacher like that, and most of us have, the burned out ones, the ones who used to love it and don't anymore, you know what it feels like to be on the receiving end. And you probably know, in hindsight, that the worst of them were suffering in their own way. That doesn't make the suffering they caused okay, but it does make them human. Let me say something about Elmore itself, as a setting, and how it shapes the relationships within it. Elmore is a place where absolutely anything can be alive. Anything. A hot dog can be a person. A cloud can be a person. A pattern on a piece of fabric can be a person. The diversity of Elmore is radical, and the show treats it as entirely normal, which is itself a statement. You don't have to look the same as someone to love them. You don't have to be the same category of being to form a bond. Darwin is a fish, and Gumball is a cat, and Penny is whatever she is now, and they're all in the same grade, all navigating the same confusing world, all trying to figure out how to be someone. The relationships in Elmore work because the show never segregates. No one looks at the fact that Alan is a balloon and Carmen is a cactus and says, well, obviously those two will never work. The show presents the pairing as normal and then explores it with the same seriousness it would apply to any relationship. The lesson isn't, it's okay to love someone different from you in a simplistic way. The lesson is more fundamental than that. The lesson is that difference is just the texture of love in Elmore. It's not an obstacle. It's part of what you navigate together. This is a very sophisticated message for a cartoon to deliver, and the sophistication is in the delivery. It's not a special episode about tolerance. It's just the way the world is. You show rather than tell, and the showing, consistently, is more effective. The water metaphor. I want to talk about Darwin and water. Darwin is a fish. He breathes through gills. He can survive on land, but he doesn't need to. He chooses to. And throughout the show, there are occasional moments where Darwin's relationship to water is relevant. He's more at home in it. It's where he comes from. And he's chosen to live almost entirely out of it, in a family and a world that doesn't have gills, because that's where he belongs now. This is such a small detail, and the show doesn't make a big deal of it, but it's there. Darwin has given up something, not painfully, not dramatically, but genuinely, to be part of the Wattersons. He's chosen a world that isn't exactly native to him, and he's made it his own. And the Wattersons, for their part, don't really think about what it costs him, because to them, he's just Darwin. He's just their brother. His difference is so integrated into who he is that the family doesn't see it as difference anymore. There's something tender in that. The way the people who love you stop seeing your differences as things that separate you. The way love normalizes. Darwin is a fish who walks. To Gumball, that sentence doesn't mean anything. It's just Darwin. Let me spend a little time on the question of loyalty, because it runs through the show in ways that are worth unpacking. The Wattersons are loyal to each other to a degree that occasionally looks irrational. They'll defend each other against forces much larger than themselves. They'll make sacrifices for each other that no reasonable cost-benefit analysis would endorse. They'll take the blame, take the hit, take the fall, if it means keeping each other okay. This loyalty is one of the most wholesome things about them, and also one of the things that occasionally creates problems. Because loyalty without judgment, loyalty that doesn't distinguish between when someone is right and when they're wrong, between when someone needs to be protected and when they need to be called out, that loyalty can enable, can cover for, can make it harder for the person you love to learn and grow. The show navigates this pretty carefully. There are episodes where Gumball's loyalty to Darwin leads him to defend something Darwin did that was actually wrong, and the episode doesn't let that slide. It shows the consequence, shows where the loyalty went wrong, shows that defending someone you love doesn't always mean defending their actions. There are episodes where Nicole's loyalty to her children, her fierce, all-consuming need to protect them, leads her to fight battles that they should be allowed to fight themselves. And again, the show examines this, rather than endorsing it. The healthiest loyalty in the show, I think, is the one that says, "I love you so much that I'll tell you when you're wrong." Nicole does this to Richard, at her best. Darwin does this to Gumball, at his best. Anais does this to everyone, basically constantly. True loyalty isn't just standing beside someone. It's caring enough about their actual well-being to be uncomfortable sometimes, to risk the relationship by being honest. That's the harder loyalty, and the more valuable one. I want to take a moment and talk about the way the show handles time, because I think it has a subtle effect on how we experience the relationships in it. The show is roughly episodic. Each episode is mostly self-contained, with continuity existing more in character development than in strict plot continuity. Penny's transformation persists. Rob's evolution persists. The Gumball-Penny relationship persists through its stages. But most of the episode-to-episode events don't carry consequences in the next episode. Things are reset, or the events are contained enough that reset is implicit. This episodic structure has an interesting effect on the relationships. It lets us see them at different temperatures. We see Gumball and Darwin on a regular Tuesday where nothing dramatic is happening. We see them in crisis. We see them bored. We see them in the specific happiness of a plan that's working before it inevitably goes wrong. We get the full range, which is more than most serialized shows give us, because serialized shows tend to only depict relationships in moments of stress or drama. The ordinary days between the big events, that's most of a relationship. Most of a relationship is Tuesday, and Gumball shows us Tuesday quite a lot, which means we feel the relationships as lived in, rather than just as plot points. This is part of why the show feels warm, even when it's dark. The warmth is baked into the structure. It's in the ordinary Tuesdays. Okay, I want to revisit the Darwin-Carrie relationship one more time, because I feel like I was a little brief on it, and there's more there. Carrie Kruger is a ghost. Her father is also a ghost, or more specifically, a ghost of a demon, which is a particular category of supernatural entity that the show treats with its characteristic mix of comedy and genuine horror. Carrie has grown up with a parent who is fundamentally different from her in kind, which has given her a particular perspective on difference and on what connection looks like across categories of being. She's also somewhat isolated by her nature. She floats. She can't eat normal food. Or rather, she can if she possesses someone else's body, which she does in at least one episode. And the moment when she tastes food for the first time through a borrowed body is played as genuinely moving. She experiences the physical world at one remove from everyone else. Darwin's feelings for Carrie are interesting partly because of this. He's not drawn to someone who is easy to be with. He's drawn to someone who exists at a distance from the ordinary world, who has a perspective that is genuinely different from his, who would require genuine effort and creativity to be close to. And Darwin, who is, remember, someone who literally lives between two worlds himself, the water world and the land world, maybe recognizes something in Carrie's in-betweenness that he knows from the inside. Their relationship, when it happens, isn't a perfect romance that resolves all complications. It's two strange beings choosing to be less alone. That's a very real description of what a lot of love actually is. Let me talk about the episodes where Gumball and Darwin go wrong with each other, because this is important. The friendship isn't perfect, and the show doesn't pretend it is. And looking at the cracks is actually one of the best ways to understand why the whole thing holds together. The boombox, or whichever episode it is where Gumball prioritizes something trivial over Darwin's actual needs, is a pattern that recurs in various forms. Gumball gets excited about something. Darwin needs something. Gumball's excitement temporarily overrides his attention to Darwin's needs. Darwin is hurt. Eventually, Gumball notices, overcorrects, and there's a reconciliation that is usually awkward and heartfelt in equal measure. What I find interesting about this pattern is that the show doesn't punish Gumball for it in a serious way. Darwin doesn't leave. Darwin doesn't decide he's done. The friendship doesn't break. And the message there could be read as, it's okay to be a bad friend as long as you apologize. But I don't think that's actually what the show is doing. I think it's doing something more specific. It's showing that deep friendships have a resilience that comes from history, from knowing each other, from having enough context to interpret an act of neglect as what it actually is. Not rejection, not a statement that the friendship doesn't matter, just Gumball being 12 and getting distracted, rather than as something catastrophic. Darwin can absorb Gumball's minor failures without it destroying the friendship because Darwin knows Gumball. He knows what Gumball's neglect means, which is approximately nothing. He knows the love is underneath the failure. And that knowing, that accumulated context, is itself one of the things that long friendships give you. The ability to interpret each other's failures correctly. Alright, there's a concept I want to introduce that I think ties together a lot of what we've been talking about, and that's the idea of holding. In psychology, and bear with me, I'm going somewhere with this, the concept of holding refers to the way caregivers provide a safe space for someone to feel things they'd otherwise suppress. A good parent holds their child's fear, meaning they receive the fear, stay present with it, and return it in a form the child can handle. A good friend holds your grief. A good partner holds your anxiety. The holding doesn't make the thing go away. The fear is still real, the grief is still real, but being held makes it survivable. Gumball and Darwin hold each other constantly, not in any explicit therapeutic way. They're 12. They're not processing their feelings with clinical terminology, but in the functional sense. When Gumball is afraid of something, Darwin is there, and Darwin's presence is itself a kind of container for the fear. When Darwin is sad, Gumball, eventually, usually after making things worse first, shows up in a way that holds the sadness without fixing it. The show depicts this through tone more than dialogue. The quality of presence between them in the difficult moments is different from the quality of presence in the ordinary ones. Nicole holds her children constantly. This is the core of what she does. She's fierce about it, because being the holder is its own kind of difficult. You absorb what the people you love are carrying, and you process it so they don't have to, and that takes something out of you. Nicole is tired in a way that the show acknowledges. The holding costs her, and she does it anyway, because that's what love looks like when it's active and devoted and chosen. Richard, wonderfully, holds Nicole. He's not always aware that he's doing it. He doesn't have the vocabulary for it. But Richard's unwavering warmth, his complete inability to sustain resentment or coldness toward Nicole, functions as a container for her. She gets to be difficult. She gets to be stressed and snappy and too much. She gets to have a bad day. And Richard doesn't take it personally, doesn't withdraw, doesn't make her manage his feelings about her difficulty. He just holds space for her to be human. This is underrated. In a show that often celebrates Nicole's competence and capability, the thing Richard contributes, the holding, the warmth, the emotional containment, is easy to miss because it's quiet, but it's significant. It's possibly the most significant thing Richard does. I want to think about what this show would look like if it had continued past its 6th season. What would Gumball and Penny look like at 15? At 20? What would Darwin be doing when the family dynamic shifts, and he has to figure out who he is as an individual, rather than as part of a pair? These are things we don't get to know, because the show ended. And in some ways that's right. It ended at the height of its powers, which is rare enough to be worth appreciating. But I find myself thinking about the trajectories, about where these relationships were heading. Gumball and Penny, I think, would have been fine. They've done the most important work already, learning to see each other as real people, rather than as the people they wished each other to be. That's the hardest part. Everything else is figuring it out as they go, which is something they're both okay at, collectively. Darwin and Carrie would have had to figure out the practicalities of their connection in a more ongoing way. What it means to be in a relationship with someone who can't touch you in the normal way, whether that's an obstacle to work around or just the particular shape of what they have. I think they would have figured it out. Darwin is nothing if not patient and creative, and Carrie is nothing if not determined. Nicole and Richard would have kept going. Nicole would have found more moments of rest as the kids needed less intense managing. Richard would have been Richard. They would have been fine, more than fine. And Rob. Rob is the one whose trajectory I find most uncertain and most interesting, because Rob's arc is fundamentally about finding a way to matter, to be a person in a world that categorized him as a mistake. And I think the show was building toward a Rob who found that way, who figured out how to matter not as Gumball's nemesis, but as himself. Whatever that looked like. We don't know, but the trajectory was there, and it was pointing somewhere good. Okay, we are really in the final stretch now. I promise. I just wanted to make sure we covered everything properly, and I think we have. Let me bring this home. Here's what I know after spending all this time with these characters and their relationships. What makes a relationship wholesome? Really, fundamentally wholesome. The kind of wholesome that doesn't wash off, isn't the absence of conflict. It's not even the presence of love. Exactly. Because love is necessary, but not sufficient. What makes a relationship wholesome is the quality of attention. Gumball pays attention to Darwin. Imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely. Nicole pays attention to her family in a way that is sometimes overwhelming, but never indifferent. Penny pays attention to what Gumball actually needs, which is often different from what he says he needs. Darwin pays attention to everyone. Anais pays attention to everything, because Anais is 4 years old and already the wisest person in the building. Attention is what the toxic relationships lack. Rob wasn't seen. Miss Simeon stopped seeing her students. Granny Jojo sees Richard, but not the grown-up person he's actually become. Attention. Real attention. The kind that notices the difference between who you were and who you are. The kind that updates its understanding of you as you change. That's the wholesome ingredient. That's what you're looking for when you're choosing who to keep in your life. And the beautiful thing about Gumball is that it shows you this through the mess. Through the schemes gone wrong, and the fights and the misunderstandings, and all the ways these characters fail each other and keep coming back. The attention isn't always clean or comfortable or well expressed. Sometimes it looks like Gumball embarrassing himself completely trying to make Penny smile. Sometimes it looks like Nicole yelling and then going very quiet, because the yelling was covering for the fear. Sometimes it looks like Richard believing in someone with a completeness that borders on the irrational and turns out to be exactly right. It's all attention, in all its chaotic, imperfect, fully committed forms. Let me slow down a little here. I realize we've been going at a decent clip, and if your brain is starting to soften around the edges, good. That's exactly what we want. You don't need to follow every thread. Just let the words happen. We've covered the main territory. What follows is the part where we get more contemplative, slower, quieter, the part that's designed for the drifting. I want to think about Gumball and water for a second. Not Darwin and water, though we talked about that, but Gumball specifically. Gumball Watterson is a cat. Cats famously don't like water, and there's a gentle joke threaded through the show about this. Gumball occasionally encountering water-related situations and having very strong feelings about them. But the thing about Gumball is that he'll do it anyway. If Darwin needs him in the water, Gumball will go in the water. Complaining the whole time, absolutely, but he'll go. And there's something small and true in that. Love is the thing that makes you do the things you hate for someone else. Not in a martyrdom way, not in a way that you hold over them later. Just, you go in the water because they need you to. There are 1,000 little versions of this in the show. Gumball staying up all night to help Darwin with something. Nicole driving an hour out of her way for something trivial that one of her kids cares about. Richard sitting through an activity he has no interest in because his child wants him there. These small acts of inconvenient love, not the grand gestures, not the dramatic sacrifices, but the Tuesday afternoon. Okay, fine. I'll do the thing I don't want to do because you want it. Those are the real texture of care. And Gumball is full of them. I keep coming back to Darwin's choice, and I want to stay with it for a bit longer, because I think it's the most philosophically interesting moment in the show's treatment of relationships. Darwin chose to stay. He could have left. He had legs. He was capable of independence. And he chose the Wattersons, chose Gumball, chose this chaotic, impractical, wonderful family over whatever other life was available to him. But here's the thing I want to add. He keeps choosing. It's not a one-time decision. Every day that Darwin stays in the Watterson house, wakes up next to Gumball, goes to school with him, comes home to Nicole and Richard and Anais, that's another choosing. And the show depicts this implicitly but consistently. Darwin is never shown as someone who is stuck. He's shown as someone who is home. There's a difference between being somewhere because you have no other option, and being somewhere because you chose it so thoroughly that the question of other options stopped mattering. Darwin is the second thing. His belonging with the Wattersons isn't circumstantial or passive. It's active. It's willed. And that quality of chosen belonging is, I think, one of the most wholesome things in the entire show. Compare it to Rob, who didn't get to choose, who had his belonging taken from him by a cosmic accident, who has been building a sense of place and identity from scratch, with no family to fall back on, no Gumball to have chosen him, no household to be home. The contrast between Darwin's chosen belonging and Rob's enforced displacement is one of the show's most heartbreaking juxtapositions if you hold them side by side. Both of them ended up in situations shaped by forces beyond their control. Darwin ended up lucky, Rob didn't. And the difference wasn't about who deserved what. The show has a lot of fun with the concept of the normal family. Because Elmore is so constitutively weird, every family in it is some unprecedented configuration of creatures and objects and circumstances. The idea of a normal family becomes something fluid. What's normal in Elmore isn't what's normal in a suburban American neighborhood. What's normal is whatever the people who love each other have figured out works for them. The Wattersons are not normal by any conventional measure. A blue cat, a goldfish, a pink rabbit toddler, and two parents who are held together primarily by Nicole's iron will and Richard's inexhaustible warmth. But they're functional. They love each other. They show up. They figure it out. And the show consistently argues, through their example, that normal is the wrong thing to aim for. Functional is what matters. Loving is what matters. The configuration is just the configuration. This is a quietly radical message for a kid's show. You don't have to look like anyone else's family. You just have to love each other and show up. The rest is details. I want to mention one more minor relationship that I think is worth naming before we fully close out. Gumball and his reflection, which is actually a character who appears in a few episodes, and what it tells us about self-knowledge. There's an episode or two where Gumball's reflection acts independently, makes different choices, has a different personality. And the dynamic between Gumball and his reflection is a kind of exaggerated version of the internal conversation everyone has with themselves. The part of you that does what you wish you had the courage to do, or that says what you're afraid to say, or that makes the worst choice because it can. The Mirror Gumball episodes are mostly comedic, but they tap into something real about identity and the relationship we have with our own tendencies. Gumball doesn't always like what he sees when he's being honest with himself. He's aware, in his more reflective moments, that he can be selfish and self-centered and impulsive in ways that hurt people. His relationship with that knowledge, his ability to sit with it without it destroying his fundamental sense that he's still worth loving, is itself something the people around him have given him. Nicole's love, Darwin's loyalty, Penny's patience. These things together constitute the ground he stands on when he has to confront the parts of himself that are less than ideal. Self-knowledge is easier when you're loved, not always easier to act on. Sometimes being loved makes it harder to change because you can get away with things in loving relationships that you'd have to address if you were alone, but easier to hold, to sit with, to not be destroyed by. The characters in this show age in a funny way. They don't really age. The show doesn't run on a timeline where Gumball is 13 in Season 6, having been 12 in Season 1. But they develop. They accumulate experience. They reference things that happened in earlier seasons as part of their shared history. The relationships have texture that comes from time, even if the time isn't literally counted out. This is a choice, and it's the right choice for this show. But it's also worth noticing for what it means about the relationships. The Gumball-Darwin friendship in Season 6 has depth that the Season 1 friendship didn't have. Not because anything dramatic changed, but because they've been through things together. Small things and large things. Ridiculous things. and genuinely frightening things. They've accumulated. And that accumulation is visible in how they move through the world together, in how they understand each other without needing to explain. One of the most wholesome things about long relationships, friendships, family bonds, partnerships, is the accumulation, the shared vocabulary, the understanding that means you can communicate a whole paragraph with a look. Gumball and Darwin have this. Nicole and Richard have this sometimes. It develops slowly, without fanfare, and it becomes one of the most valuable things in any relationship. I want to revisit the ending of the show one more time, because I said something about it earlier, but I want to sit with it more deliberately. The final season of Gumball, and particularly its final episodes, has a quality of deliberate conclusion to it. The show knows its ending, and it makes choices in those final episodes that are about giving the characters and the audience something to take away. Not a plot resolution, exactly. The show was never primarily about plot, but an emotional resolution. A sense of where these people are, and that they're okay. What the final episodes give us is the Wattersons being the Wattersons. Fully, completely, in all their chaos and warmth and fundamental togetherness. They're not better than they were at the start of the show. They're not worse. They're themselves, having been themselves consistently through 6 seasons of impossible situations. And that continuity of selfhood, the fact that they kept being who they are despite everything, is the resolution. Nicole is still fierce. Richard is still Richard. Gumball is still convinced he's the hero of everything. Darwin is still the heart of the family. Anais is still the most competent person in any room she enters. And they still love each other, fully and chaotically and completely, the way they always have. That's what the show earns by the end. Not a different outcome, not a transformation, not a neatly resolved conflict. Just confirmation that what was there was real and that it persists. I find that genuinely moving. The confirmation of continuity, the assurance that the love is still going. If you've watched Gumball, and especially if you watched it young, the way it was intended to be watched, the first time through, you probably feel something about these characters that you might not have the right words for. A kind of tenderness, a kind of recognition, a sense that these are people you know, even though they're a blue cat and a goldfish and a family of pink rabbits and whoever else. That's what good storytelling does. It makes you feel known by showing you characters who feel real. It creates a space where your own experiences, your own confusing feelings about your family, your own complicated feelings about your best friend, your own mess of insecurity and hope and affection get reflected back at you in a way that says, yes, that's normal. You're not alone in that. Gumball does this at a high level, higher than you might expect from the premise. Higher than most shows that set out specifically to be emotionally resonant manage to achieve. And it does it with humor and absurdism and a cast of creatures that includes at least one literal balloon, which is an achievement in its own right. Actually, I want to stay with the Alan and Carmen relationship one more minute because I glossed over something important. There's a particular quality to their relationship that I think is instructive in a way that the show doesn't make explicit. Carmen and Alan have managed what sounds impossible. A relationship where one person could literally destroy the other through ordinary contact, and they've managed it by developing a very specific kind of awareness. A real-time, constant, low-level calibration about proximity and pressure and care. Most relationships don't require this level of explicit care. Most people can hug without it being a safety concern. But Alan and Carmen have had to develop an attentiveness that other couples get to take for granted. And the result is that they are probably, in practice, more consciously caring toward each other than the relationships where people can afford to be careless. Necessity has made them thoughtful in a way that's become their normal. I think about this sometimes in the context of relationships where one person has a need that requires the other person to be more careful than they'd otherwise naturally be, where the partnership asks something specific and consistent of both people. Those relationships, when they work, often have a quality of attention that other relationships don't develop unless they have to. The care is baked in, not because the people involved are unusually saintly, but because the configuration demands it. Alan and Carmen didn't choose to be a balloon and a cactus. They just are. And they've built something beautiful in the specific shape that being what they are allows. Let me also mention something about Gumball and the concept of failure, because this show is, at its structural core, a show about things going wrong. Every episode, something goes wrong, plans fail, schemes backfire, consequences arrive. And the question the show keeps posing is not how to avoid failure, but what to do with it when it happens. How to be with the people you love after the failure. How to keep going. The answer Gumball consistently gives is with each other. You do it with each other. The failure isn't pleasant, and the consequences aren't fun, but you come out the other side of it still the Wattersons, still Darwin and Gumball, still Penny and Gumball working on being real together. The relationships are what you fall back into after the episode has gone catastrophically wrong. They're the landing pad. That's what I want to leave with you. The idea of love as a landing pad, as the place you come back to after whatever went wrong today, as the softest place to fall. I hope you have some of that. I hope there are people in your life you fall back into, who receive you when things have gone sideways, who don't make it worse, who are just there in the good and consistent way that Darwin is there for Gumball, that Nicole is there for her family. I hope you are that for someone else too. And if tonight you're alone with this video, with just a voice talking about cartoon characters while the room is quiet, that's okay. Plenty of nights are like that. The Wattersons will keep the company tonight. Gumball is probably scheming something right now in whatever corner of the universe cartoon characters go when no one is watching. Darwin is probably right beside him, already knowing it's going to go wrong, already planning to stay anyway. Nicole is probably holding everything together with characteristic ferocity. Richard is probably happy. Anais is probably the only one who knows what's actually going to happen. They're all there. They always are. And in the particular way that stories work, in the way that characters you love become part of your furniture, part of the steady background of your inner life, part of the internal landscape you carry from childhood onward. They're a little bit yours now. That's the strange and lovely thing about stories. They stay with you. They become part of the texture of how you understand the world, how you understand what love looks like when it's working, and what it looks like when it isn't. The Wattersons are part of that texture for a lot of people. Or maybe you've already known them for years, and tonight was just a chance to know them a little more deliberately. Either way, they'll keep. They're good company at this hour. Warm and chaotic and fundamentally, stubbornly loving all the way down. Alright, I think we've done it now. I think we've gone through all of it. The toxic and the complex and the wholesome. The big moments and the small ones. The episodes that made you feel things you weren't prepared to feel, and the quiet Tuesday afternoons between them. The rankings, one final time, from most difficult to most wholesome. Rob and Gumball, with their wound of being forgotten, and their slow, painful movement towards something better. Miss Simeon and her students, with all the weight of an ancient bitterness, aimed at people who don't deserve it. The jealousy patterns that show up in Gumball's character and need to be worked on. Granny Jojo and Richard. Love that calcified into control. Principal Brown and Miss Simeon. A relationship that enables rather than challenges. Then the complex middle. Nicole and Richard. Complicated and real and ongoing. Darwin and Carrie. Strange and tender and still figuring it out. Gumball and Penny. Learning to see each other clearly across all the noise of being young and in love. Then the wholesome, Penny's arc toward herself. Nicole's fierce and growing love for her children. Anais in the center of a family that loves her from all angles. Hector figuring out how to be in the world. Alan and Carmen being careful with each other's particular fragility. And at the top, where it has been since season 1, Gumball and Darwin. Two beings who chose each other, who keep choosing. There's something I want to say before we close about what we've been doing for the last however long this has taken you to get through. We've been talking about a cartoon that aired on Cartoon Network and was made for kids. And I've been treating it with the same seriousness I'd bring to almost anything because I think it deserves it. Part of what Cartoon does, part of what I love about this format, this whole thing we do here, is take the stories that we absorbed when we were young and look at them again with older eyes. Not to debunk them, or to find problems with them, but to see what was actually in there, what the people who made these shows were actually saying, sometimes to us, and sometimes through us, about what love is, and what it costs, and what it looks like when it's good, and when it isn't. Gumball, watched again as an adult, is saying something clear and consistent about relationships. It's saying that love isn't passive. It's saying that the people who love you best are the ones who see you, not the version of you that's easiest to love, but you, weird and complicated and sometimes embarrassing and frequently wrong. It's saying that the toxicity in our lives usually comes from pain, not evil, and that understanding the pain doesn't excuse the toxicity, but does make it something you can work with, rather than something you simply have to endure or run from. It's also saying that sometimes a goldfish grows legs and walks into your life and becomes your whole world. And that's fine. That's actually kind of the best. There's one more relationship I haven't mentioned yet, and that I feel genuinely bad about overlooking: Gumball and his imagination. The show depicts Gumball as someone who has an active, vivid inner life, not just in the way that all kids do, but specifically. He invents stories. He puts himself in them. He narrates his own experience in real time, with himself as the hero, and the gap between the story he's telling himself and the thing that's actually happening is one of the great comedic engines of the show. But it's also a relationship dynamic, because the stories Gumball tells himself about the people in his life affect how he treats them. He tells himself that Penny is perfect, and that belief, the story he's made of her, makes it harder for him to see her clearly. Until the shell, when the real Penny shows up so definitively that the story has to give way. He tells himself that he and Darwin are the greatest team in Elmore, and that story is mostly accurate. But the moments when it's not, the moments when Darwin is a separate person with his own needs, and not just Gumball's co-protagonist, those moments require Gumball to revise the story, which he does, slowly, imperfectly, with Darwin's patient help. He tells himself that he's the main character. And on some level, in the meta sense, in the way the show occasionally winks at itself, he's right. But being the main character of your own life doesn't mean everyone else is a supporting cast. Learning that is part of growing up. Learning that every person around you is the main character of their own story, running in parallel with yours, just as real and just as full. Gumball gets this lesson, eventually, over and over, because it's the kind of lesson that you keep having to learn. But he gets it, and each time he gets it, something in him settles a little more into the reality of the people he loves, as opposed to the story he's built around them. And a brief word about the Wattersons' neighbor, Larry, who appears in the background of many episodes working many different jobs. Larry is everywhere in Elmore. He runs the gas station, and the grocery store, and the restaurant, and apparently every service-oriented business in town. His relationship with the Wattersons is largely one of exasperation. They're consistently difficult customers, in the way that the Wattersons are consistently difficult at everything. But he keeps showing up, keeps serving them, keeps existing in their orbit. There are episodes where Larry gets pushed too far and revolts in various ways, and the Wattersons have to reckon with having taken him for granted. I include Larry because I think there's something worth noting in the way the show treats background characters with real interiority. Larry has wants and limits, and a breaking point. The person who hands you your groceries is a person with a whole story. Gumball, the show, keeps insisting on this, quietly, through the consistency with which it gives background characters real reactions and real consequences. Everyone in Elmore is someone. That's the commitment. And that commitment is itself a form of wholesome. A world that insists everyone counts is a warmer world. There's one last thing, and it's something the show does quietly in the last few seasons that I don't want to leave unacknowledged. The world of Elmore starts to crack. The simulation, and by the later seasons, the show has committed to the idea that Elmore might be a constructed world, a simulation running on old technology, starts to show its seams. Characters become aware of the artifice. Rob, who has always been on the margins of the constructed world, helps Gumball understand what he's actually living in, and Gumball has to decide what that means. What it means, in the end, is that the show chooses love over certainty. Gumball knows his world might not be real in the way he thought it was, and he chooses to keep loving the people in it. He chooses Darwin. He chooses his family. He chooses Penny, not because the reality is guaranteed, but because the love is real, even if the world isn't. Because the people he loves are real to him, even if they're not real in the technical sense. That's a pretty extraordinary thing to put at the end of a cartoon. The idea that love persists, even when the ground shifts under it. That the relationships are the real thing, not the world they happen in. One more thing before I let you sleep. The title of this video is about ranking relationships from toxic to wholesome. And I've done that, I think, with some faithfulness to both the show and to what those words mean. But I want to complicate the ranking one final time, because I think the most honest thing I can say is this. The show doesn't actually believe in fixed rankings. The relationships at the toxic end of our list have love in them. Imperfect, broken, misdirected love. But love. Rob didn't become Gumball's nemesis out of emptiness. He did it out of a need to matter, which is one of the most fundamental human needs there is. Miss Simeon didn't become bitter in a vacuum. She's been trying to connect with students for longer than anyone should have to. And somewhere in the calcification is a person who cared enough to keep trying for a very long time. And the relationships at the wholesome end, Gumball and Darwin, Nicole and her family, they have difficult moments in them. Moments of failure and misunderstanding and pain. They're wholesome, not because they're painless, but because the people in them keep trying. Because the love keeps winning, even on the hard days. That's what wholesome actually means, I think, when you strip away the comfortable version of the word. It doesn't mean easy. It means whole, complicated, and real, and still going. The lights are low wherever you are. The screen is probably dimming. Whatever was on your mind when you started this video has probably quieted a little, because it tends to work that way. Give the brain something interesting to follow, and it starts to let go of the things it was gripping. You were good today, even if it didn't feel that way. Even if things were hard, or weird, or just flat in the way some days are flat. You made it to tonight, you're here, and tomorrow is a new set of choices. Like the Wattersons, you'll figure it out. Probably with some chaos. Probably not on the first try, but you'll figure it out. Good night, everyone. Sleep well. End of script. Channel, Cartoon HD. Video, fall asleep. To every relationship. In Gumball ranked from toxic to wholesome. Variation, opening equals real-world anchoring. Structure equals reversal. Register equals playful mischief. Closing equals quiet landing.